Ladies, we're talking about submission.
Whoa, the S starting off with the S word?
The S word, but maybe not in the way that you think. So don't click out of this just yet.
All right, let's get into that. Before we get into today's episode, just wanted to remind you that in the description of the video below, we put links to all of our social media accounts.
You can always reach us with questions or comments about this episode at marriagebydesignpodcast@gmail.com.
And finally, if you want to support us financially, there is a link to be able to do so at the end of each of the descriptions of our videos. Now, let's get back to the show. Hey everybody, I'm Nathan Warnock.
I'm Andrea Warnock, and you've joined us for Marriage Monday on the Marriage by Design podcast. This is a time that we get to talk to you about God's design for marriage, what the Bible has to say about that, and how we live that out practically.
That's right. So what are we talking about this Monday, baby?
Okay, so we're talking about submission. And
more people clicked out.
Yeah, I know. Please don't click out. No, it's not. It's maybe not your typical submission talk that you've heard before. Right. We've talked before on our channel about submission and
yes,
what that looks like, what it is, what it isn't, and that's all good stuff. And if I had the time, I would probably talk about that again.
Okay.
But I'm getting into something a little bit different this time. And my big point, I'm just going to reveal it right now. My big point is that as wives submit to their husbands by their behavior, by their wives' behavior, they point their husbands back to the Lord. And that is the big point. That's a great part of submission and leadership and love, is that when we get it going, it's it's this thing that kind of feeds into the other thing, right? Kind of like the life-giving cycle or whatever that is talked about in Love and Respect.
Sure. Energizing cycle.
The energizing cycle. Yeah. It's the same way with submission to leadership and leadership that feeds into submission, right? It's the same way. If we can just get the wheel going, it turns much easier and it feeds each other. And it's kind of the same way with with the cycle.
Right. And when you're talking about we point our husbands back to the Lord, you're not just talking to women whose husbands are not believers.
Oh, yeah. Right. I'm talking about women. I'm talking about Nathan, and I'm talking about guys who have totally submitted their lives to the Lord too and are walking with the Lord. But our submission can point certainly unbelieving men, but also men who trust the Lord and have given their lives to the Lord. We can still keep pointing them back to the Lord too.
Great. So, can't wait to hear it.
Yeah.
All right. So what do you got?
So I'm going to be talking to you about that submission is a human problem. It's not just a wife problem.
Right.
That true submission is love.
Okay.
How our submission points our husbands to the Lord, and then how we can entrust our submission to the Lord.
All right.
So let's get into first that submission is a human problem. It's not just the problem that a problem or a journey that a wife goes on, right, in marriage, but it's a human problem. But also it's the solution to our problem. So back in the fall, which is when Adam and Eve chose to sin, we can go back to Genesis for that. We see that they were told they could not eat. They could eat of all the trees in the garden, but they could not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? So they had the whole garden except this one tree. Don't eat the fruit. And Satan tempted them. What are you smiling?
Yeah,
Did you have
because of course that would be the one.
Right. It's just like
we have kids. I know what that's like. Just you can play with any toy in this house. Just don't climb up on the kitchen table.
Yeah. Right. And that's all they want to do, right? It's a problem. Anyway, so Adam and Eve chose to eventually eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Right. So they sinned. Sin entered the world, death through sin. And so they're really that sin was a failure to submit to the Lord's plan for their life. God had given them, hey, this is the plan. And they chose not to submit to that. So that became a human problem because then sin entered the world. So forever now, since Adam and Eve, we've been dealing with our sin problem. And but our choice to submit to the Lord and to his authority and his word brings about salvation. So if we choose to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, we will be saved, right? And that submission to his authority, to his death on the cross, bringing about salvation, that brings about our salvation. So interesting that submission caused our problem, but submission is also the solution to our problem.
Yeah, that's great.
And submission is what then brings unity to our marriage, just as submission to the Lord brings about unity in our relationship with him, because we are apart from him. You know, we cannot have relationship with him if we don't submit ourselves to the gift of salvation. That brings the salvation brings unity to our relationship with the Lord, just as submission in our marriage brings unity within our marriage.
Right.
So we need to have submission first to the Lord, and then the husband must have submission to the Lord's authority over him,
Mm-hmm.
and the marriage, and then the wife is to be submitted to the Lord and submitted to the husband's leadership in the marriage, and all of that is to bring unity within the marriage. And in our relationship.
To make it more of a picture of Christ's desired relationship with us as his people.
Of course.
So it all feeds back into that picture.
Yep. So that is submission is a human problem, but it's also the solution to our problem. So then my next point is that true submission is love, not legalism. So if we are not desiring to obey the Lord and our hearts aren't submitted to him and our husband's leadership, we will only maybe perform to as much of a degree as necessary to check the box, right? So, and that checking the box is called legalism. And the definition of legalism is adherence to law or formula. So if we don't actually have the desire to submit, but we're just trying to do the darn thing, you know, we're just trying to make it look like we're submitting to our husbands and enough to check the box, that's just being legalistic. It's not love, it's legalism.
Yep.
And that's not what God is asking. We can't say, yes, check the box, I believe Jesus died for my sin, done, moving on. That's legalism, and that doesn't work. Just like legalism in submitting in our marriage you'll find that doesn't work, and it's not born out of love. But so here we have if we're going to be legalistic, we have a problem. But there's also an opportunity to change that and to submit out of love that changes and unites a relationship through that submission out of love. And a great example of that is if you have kids or you've been around kids, you will let's think of a child who is only doing as much of what the parent asks them to do in order to check the box or make it look like I'm being obedient. Like, don't touch that cookie, but they're going to maybe put their finger as close as they can to that cookie without actually touching it. And they'll probably put their nose as close to it as they can. You know, that's not loving submission. That's checking the box. I'm not doing what you said, but I'm going to come as close to, I'm going to toe the line as close as I can. Right. Whereas another child who submits out of love, if you say, don't touch that cookie, would probably say, okay, and just go as far away from the cookie as they can and go do their own thing and
forget all about
move on. That's a different kind of submission.
Right.
Are they both submitting to what their parent asked them to do?
Technically.
Yes. Right. Technically. But what's the heart behind that?
Right.
So if you think about that in the relationship with what God asks us to do, to submit to our husbands, are we doing that out of love for the Lord and out of love for our husband or are we choosing to be legalistic and are we bitter about that? Are we finding ways to control, but also make that look submissive? You know, with that example of the child and the cookie, what sort of relationship does that bring about between the child and the parent? If you have a child who's constantly towing the line, yes, being obedient, but towing the line, trying to get you aggravated because they're trying to make you think that they're maybe gonna at any moment not be obedient.
Right.
You know, they kind of have they have your attention, and not in a good way. Whereas the child who's obeying out of love because they believe that what your plan for them is, and this is more about submission to the Lord. Your plan for them is good. Your plan for them is is loving for them, and they believe that, and they're like, okay, I'm going to do what my parents say because I know they love me and they know what's best for me, and they're going to stay far away from temptation and doing the opposite of what you said because they trust you.
Right.
That's a totally different thing. So the relationship that parent and child will have will be totally different.
Yeah, this has an allegory or a similar a brother problem with regards to male leadership and male sacrifice we've talked about on this program before, and that's there's tons of guys that when Ephesians talks about sacrificing as Christ sacrificed himself for the church and gave himself up for the church, there's a lot of guys we've talked about that are probably willing to die for their spouse, like actually die, but they're not willing to do day-to-day sacrifices.
Yeah, the joke we say is, sure, you'll die for your wife, but will you take the trash out?
Right. This is a similar problem that we see in women, in that they, like if Christian women in particular, if their husband showed up and was like, to use our classic example, hey, we're going to be potato farmers in Idaho next week, I really believe those women would go, okay, I don't understand, but you're the leader. But meanwhile, they're undermining that leadership in little small ways and controlling in small ways throughout the normal day. So it's like they know, hey, if he says this needs to happen, totally willing to submit, but like not other than that. Like guys that are like totally willing to take a bullet if someone robs our house, but not really sacrifice for her other than that. It's funny that it's the same,
it's like
the same
big,
problem.
broad things,
right?
Like the details.
Yeah, it's almost that legalistic. Like, yes, I'll give myself up for her, like Christ did the church. Like if someone said, hey, I'm going to kill your wife unless you let me crucify you, probably guys would let themselves get crucified for their wives. But will you do the daily stuff? And I'd say ask the same question to women. Like I think there's a lot of women that would, if their husband said, hey, we're homeschooling the kids, darn it, they'd go, okay, well, out of submission to you, we'll do that. But do they submit in little small ways? And I mean, Nathan could probably attest to
that I struggle with the small ways. That, right? We're honest here. I think that's one of our big core values of this channel.
Yeah. I think we both struggle with exactly what I just said.
Right.
Like I think, and I don't think we're alone. I think there's a problem, particularly in Christian marriages. We are willing to do the big thing, but it's the daily submission. It's the daily sacrifice.
Right.
That not only isn't getting done, but it's the one that's really wrecking your marriage.
Yeah, and I think my point in saying that was, I think there's a lot of times where I can only talk from the woman's perspective. I don't even recognize it, right? Like, sure. Because submitting in the big things and just choosing, okay, I can go on that. I'm going to follow you on that, is easier to do, I guess, or easier to understand in my brain and in our marriage. But the smaller things, I don't even recognize that I'm not in submission or that I'm trying to control or whatever that looks like. And so maybe as women, we need those pointed out to us and to have a conversation, because the men might be over here saying yeah, she says she's submissive, but I'm not seeing it. And the women might be like, I'm totally submitting to your authority. And she's just it's a blind spot. It's a complete blind spot.
Right.
And
Yeah,
her desire might be to submit out of love and not be legalistic, but she's missed the boat somewhere and needs help finding the boat, you know?
Yeah, let's circle back to this when we get to your third point, because I think this is an important thing to think about.
Hey, we're on to our third point. Okay,
oh my
so,
gosh, we're
so
here
second
already.
point was true submission is love, not legalism. Okay, and now we're on to our third point, which is how does our true submission point our husbands back to the Lord? So I guess that's not a point, it's a question. But anyway, we'll get to the point. So I'm going to read First Peter.
You're so hard on yourself.
I'm going to read 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7. And it says, by the way, just for time's sake, I have so many more things that I could say about.
This is going to be a 6-hour episode.
I can't talk for that long, but I have so many things that I could say about so many that I wanted to say and could say about submission, but I'm not going to take up your whole whatever part of the day this is. But
and we did do an episode on submission, like the technical part of what submission is.
Yeah, and submission adjacent topics too. But anyway, if you go back to, so I'm in 1 Peter 3 right now, but if you go back to 2, starting in 13, it's talking about submission to authority. And that's a good part to read because then it goes into chapter 3, verse 1. And so it's not like just out of the blue, we're talking about wives being submissive to husbands.
Right.
This is a whole part of this book that's just talking about submission in general,
right.
And
that's
the
right.
importance of submission in different relationships and
Yep.
how that is showing love, and it's also bringing about unity and order.
Yeah.
And so just keep that in mind as we read this. So chapter 3 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 1 says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Ooh. So, lots of stuff that we could really dig into here, but the first, it talks about wives submitting their husbands. And just as we say with other things, there is no condition on that as far as if they're like submit to their leadership, if they're a good leader, or if you're in a good mood with him or whatever. It just says to do it. Right. And of course, we don't submit because our priority is the Lord. So if our husband is asking us to sin, then that's not a submission. You do not need to fall under his submission because your first priority is the Lord. So,
that's right. Someday we would need to do an episode that just asks the question, is submission the same as obedience?
Right. And I think that's why, there's so many reasons why the world and Christian women really struggle with the word submission, because it seems like I'm a carpet, walk on me sort of a thing.
Yep.
And that's not the relationship that Nathan and I have with each other.
No.
And it's not like my voice is not heard or that I can't speak when I disagree. So that is not submission, and submission is not blind obedience.
No, that's right.
Or anything like that. It is.
Now you spoiled the episode.
It is leadership and following the leadership, right? So
and not controlling.
It's not controlling. It's not blind obedience.
Unconditional respect, right?
Yep.
That Paul talks about. Yep.
Yep.
It's good.
It's choosing to, hey, I've hitched my wagon to this guy. I'm going to choose to let him lead.
Right.
Because I've already hitched it. Okay.
Right.
So I think how does our true submission point our husbands back to the Lord? And there's a big point in that says our true submission. And that goes back to point 2, our loving submission.
Yep.
That is not legalistic, because that's not going to, your legalistic submission is not going to point your husband to the Lord.
No, where's it going to point him?
probably to being mad at you. No, I mean,
it's going to point him away from the Lord.
Right. Of course, it's going to point him to frustration because he's trying to lead and you're not actually following. You're just trying to check a box. And that's felt just as a parent. That's felt when you have a child who's just doing as little as possible to still be obedient. You can feel that, that. And that's not going to develop a deeper relationship. Why are you laughing?
Well, because I mean,
not that we have experience in that.
Right. Thank you.
Ever.
Thank
right.
you. Right. But other people we know.
So be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives.
It's really good. That verse is great.
It is really great because that means that if we have unbelieving husbands, we don't have to preach at him. We can just do what God's asked us to do and fall under his leadership and his authority. And the Lord will speak to him through that. Mm-hmm. And it's also, hey, if our husbands that do love the Lord are veering in the wrong direction, if we're choosing to respect him and follow his leadership, the Lord will work in that.
Yep.
And we have to trust the Lord that he'll do that.
Yeah, I think Peter, under the influence of the Holy Spirit, is pointing out an important thing here, which is that the most likely way you are to win your husband is without a word.
Yeah, because then it goes on that it's not, let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious.
But how many couples do we see where the wife is convinced that the issue is I just haven't said the right words in the right order at the right volume at the right time, when the reality is that's not how it's going to happen. It's going to happen by your quiet conduct, not by your words.
And that is so hard.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
But that gets us to our last point, which is we need to entrust our submission to the Lord. Because we need to trust that the Lord's plan is right.
Yeah.
And we can trust him in that, even when we feel like our husband is going awry in his leadership, or
I don't know why you looked at me.
I don't think I looked around the room. Our husband is going awry in his leadership, maybe, or is he even hearing from the Lord? Does he even care to hear from the Lord? Is he leading well?
Yep.
Is he caring about me? All those sorts of things. It doesn't mean you can't have a conversation with him, but fear not. We can entrust the Lord with our submission and allow the Lord to do the work in our husband's heart. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen that in Nathan. I can't tell you how many times we've seen that in other people's marriages where the wife was choosing to submit and the husband miraculously, I mean, it seriously feels like a miracle, miraculously changes in this way that was needing to be changed because the Lord met him where he was.
Right.
So in talking about that, Jesus gives us a great example of him entrusting his submission to the Lord. In 1 Peter 2:23, again, that's the part that I was saying is talking about kind of general submission and submission to authority. So in 2:23, it says, when he, talking about Jesus, was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So when he was being persecuted and was about to be killed for no reason at all, he entrusted his submission to the will of the Father and trusted that the Lord would work that out. So we have an example of that in Jesus himself. And then Luke 22:42, same situation, but a little bit different. Luke 22:42 is Jesus knowing that this time was coming where he was going to die.
About to be arrested.
Well, yes, he was about to be arrested, but we're not maybe he knew what was coming and maybe he didn't. But
yeah,
as far as death on a cross.
Here's the thing. I don't know about that, but we can definitely say that he probably knew he was in trouble.
Right.
The Romans.
Right. So Luke 22:42 says, he says, Father, Jesus is talking to the Lord. Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.
Man.
Jesus was God himself, right? The Lord, God in flesh. But he submitted to the will of the Father. He wanted another route for salvation other than his death or whatever was coming up. But yet he was willing to die if that was the only way to. So he trusted the Father's will and plan, even so much as to trust him with death on the cross.
Yep.
And so just as Jesus entrusted his submission to the Lord, therefore we should entrust our submission as wives to the Lord and trust that God will work out the plan. He can work in our husbands' hearts. He can work in our own hearts when we're not wanting to submit or really struggling because this seems like blaring lights, like this is not the right way, you know. But we can still trust the Lord in that. And
Right.
really it's our husband's responsibility to lead. And so they will be the ones that receive the discipline if they lead in the wrong direction.
Yep.
And not us when we follow.
Yeah, it's really hard to overstate the influence that you have as a wife on your husbands. I mean, there have been so many couples where we've talked to them, known them, walked with them for a season, and it just becomes so apparent to me how much influence you women have, for good or for bad, on your husbands. And you know, I mean, you can go back and look. I just got done in my Bible study group reading through a lot of the books of history and Chronicles and Kings, and it's amazing how many times in those books it says so-and-so became king of Israel. He did good in the sight of the Lord, or more often than that, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And then almost always that sentence is followed by a woman of influence in that person's life.
Yeah.
Either their wife or their mother. And it seems weird that keeps making its way into the Bible, but I believe that as women, you play such an instrumental role in shaping the men in your lives. And certainly that starts with your husband, who's the individual you probably have the most influence in. But the influence you have is not when you try to exert it, right? It's not by manipulation. It's by quiet,
Gosh darn it.
quiet action, as First Peter said. So
Yep.
it's great, babe. Wow, great. So give us the points one more time, real quick.
Yeah. So submission is a human problem, but it's also the solution to our problems. True submission is love, not legalism. Our submission points our husbands back to the Lord, and then we can entrust our submission to the Lord.
Brilliant. That's great, man, babe. Thanks for leading that episode. I appreciate that. All right, guys. Hopefully, there's something you took away from this episode as a talk, and hopefully, there's something challenging to take away for you yourself. I'd love to have you go check out those verses that Andrea talked about in 1 Peter, the end of chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3, as well as in Luke 22. So, guys, appreciate you joining us. We will be back at you next Monday with a brand new episode. Until then, thanks so much for joining us. And remember, God is for your marriage.